Tonight, we drift quietly into the candlelit halls and whispered family secrets of Europe's royal courts, where beauty, power, and bloodlines were tangled in ways best described as complicated. The first thing you notice is the quiet. Not the kind of silence you get when the world is empty, but the muffled, thick stillness of tapestries swallowing sound, of stone walls guarding whispers like their crown jewels. The only interruptions are the faint crackle of a fire that has long since given up being ambitious and the slow drip of wax from a candle, its flame swaying as though it's bored of existing. You're in a corridor of a royal palace. Not the bustling, gossip-filled space you might expect, but one that feels as if it's been holding its breath for decades. The air smells faintly of beeswax, dust, and that oddly metallic tang of old stone. A draft slides along the floor, brushing your ankles like a cold cat. Somewhere, far down the hall, a door creaks. A slippered footstep follows. Then another. You might imagine something dramatic is about to happen. But here, in these royal halls, drama often arrives wearing soft shoes and taking very small, deliberate steps. You've found yourself in 16th century Europe, and, how to put this politely, the royal family tree looks a little repetitive. Historians would call it dynastic consolidation. Ordinary people would call it keeping it all in the family. You will meet princesses whose family resemblance is less a gentle feature and more a bold architectural blueprint stamped on every face in the room. Tonight's journey will wander through the lives of these daughters, paraded in gowns of brocade and pearls, traded across borders like finely wrapped letters of alliance, and sometimes caught in the awkward geometry of marriages arranged between people who shared more than just a family crest. You probably won't make it through this day without wanting to shake someone and say, "Have you considered literally anyone else?" But for now, just stay quiet. The walls here are good at keeping secrets, but they also have a talent for listening. Before we step deeper into the story, take a moment to settle in. If you're enjoying this soft dive into royal eccentricities, tap the little thumbs up. Yes, even here in the 1500s, your gesture of approval matters. If you'd like to keep company on future journeys through history's stranger corners, subscribe and tell me in the comments where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now let's ease into tonight's journey. The corridor leads you toward the Great Hall, though great is relative here. It's less a place for feasts and more a space for negotiation, ceremony, and showing off who can stand the longest without fainting. In one corner, a group of courtiers pretend to be fascinated by the embroidery on each other's sleeves. They're talking about a wedding, two names you almost recognize, both belonging to branches of the same tangled family. It's an odd thing, this fixation on bloodlines. Royal daughters are raised like delicate treasures but appraised like cattle. They're groomed to sit still, smile softly, and answer questions in languages that aren't their own. You pass by one such young woman, her gown heavy with silver thread, her expression the perfect blend of composure and quiet panic. She's 17, though the weight in her eyes makes her look older. Here's your first historical fact for the evening. In the Habsburg dynasty, one of the most inbred royal families in Europe, it was not uncommon for uncles to marry nieces, or for first cousins to wed as though the family reunion had simply extended into the altar. This wasn't romance. It was politics, stitched together with lace and ambition. There's also an odd cultural tidbit you might appreciate. In some courts, brides and grooms were weighed before the wedding to ensure the bride was of healthy constitution and the groom suitable for breeding. Imagine that your first marital memory being a formal weigh-in, as though you're a prized goose. Historians still debate whether such traditions were sincerely believed to improve the royal line or simply became rituals no one dared question. You suspect a bit of both, though in truth, ritual often outlives reason in places like this. The fire in the hall pops softly, and you step closer to the young woman with the silver thread gown. She glances at you for only a second before lowering her eyes. You notice her hands, slender, but her knuckles are prominent, her nails short and clean. She smells faintly of lavender, though you suspect the scent comes from a sachet sewn into her dress rather than anything she applied herself. Around you, the conversation hums like bees in a distant garden. The wedding talk fades into a discussion of dowries, then lands, always lands. These daughters are not just brides. They're the currency of peace. And peace, here, is as fragile as the thin glass goblets clinking in the background. You walk toward the window. Outside, the gardens are bare, winter having stripped them down to their bones. Snow has gathered in the crooks of the hedges, and a frozen fountain stands like an arrested gesture. Somewhere beyond the walls, people are living lives untouched by these gilded corridors. Fishing, baking bread, gossiping about the weather. But in here, the world turns on the alliances sealed with rings and sealed tighter with bloodlines. You hear footsteps again, faster this time. A young page, flushed from running, enters the hall and bows to the presiding noble. He whispers something about a messenger from a neighboring kingdom. The noble's face does not change, but you sense the ripple moving through the room. News in this place is never just news, it's either opportunity or threat, and sometimes both. You decide to stay a little longer by the window, letting the heat from the fire warm your back while the cold presses at the glass. For now, your role is that of the quiet observer. The messenger is not dramatic. No galloping horses or dripping cloaks. Instead, he enters like a shadow, his black wool coat shedding faint traces of frost onto the floor. His boots are dusty, his eyes quick. You'd almost miss him if it weren't for the way the courtiers lean forward, subtly tilting their bodies toward him as though trying to catch the scent of news. You can't hear every word, but you pick up the important parts. Another marriage proposal. This one's from a cousin across the border. Not just a cousin, the cousin. The one who also happens to be the young woman's uncle by marriage, twice removed but still carrying enough of the same family features to make the wedding portrait look symmetrical. You have to remind yourself that in this world, love is rarely part of the conversation. The young woman, let's call her Isabella, will smile and nod and accept, because to refuse is to risk her entire family's position. If you're lucky, she'll get a husband who's kind. If you're unlucky, she'll get a husband who enjoys hawking and hunting and considers conversation an unnecessary luxury. The room begins to shift into motion. A scribe appears with parchment, quills, and a small pot of ink. A woman in a wimple and fur-lined cloak begins whispering names and titles. The whole thing is less about two people and more about two maps being gently pushed together so the borders line up. Historical fact for this section. Charles II of Spain, the last Habsburg ruler of his line, was so severely affected by generations of inbreeding that he could barely speak, walk, or chew properly, and he died without an heir. While he's not part of tonight's immediate setting, his existence looms in the background like a ghostly warning. Weird cultural tidbit. In some courts, when a royal child was born, a special appointed witness was allowed to watch the birth to ensure the baby was legitimate. Yes, an actual stranger, often a bishop or nobleman, standing awkwardly in the corner while history's most uncomfortable introductions were made. Historians still debate whether these birth witnesses truly believed their presence could prevent scandal, or if it was simply a public relations exercise with worse lighting. The young Isabella excuses herself from the hall, her steps slow but measured. You follow at a respectful distance. She slips into a smaller chamber, where the fire is lower and the air smells faintly of rosemary and smoke. The walls here are hung with smaller tapestries, pastoral scenes of shepherds and sheep that feel miles away from the cold negotiations outside. She sits by the hearth and begins unfastening the stiff, jeweled collar at her throat. For a moment, she closes her eyes, and the flickering light turns her face into something softer, less guarded. You imagine she's thinking about the road ahead, about the cousin she's never truly spoken to, about the places she'll never see again once she leaves, about the family crest that will be embroidered onto every hem she wears from now until the end of her days. You take a seat on the opposite bench, feeling the old wood creak under your weight. The warmth is hypnotic, and your own eyelids grow heavy. But the moment is broken by a sudden burst of laughter from the hall beyond, jarring, almost absurd against the quiet here. You remember the street you walked past earlier? It's back. This time in your mind's eye, cobblestones slick with ice, merchants closing shutters against the dark, children chasing each other through the last light of the day. That world feels freer somehow, even with all its hardships. The fire pops again, and Isabella opens her eyes. She notices you, but she doesn't speak. Instead, she pulls a small bundle from under her chair, a square of cloth embroidered with tiny flowers. Perhaps it's a keepsake from home, or perhaps it's something she's making to take with her. Either way, it's a quiet rebellion against the fact that so much of her life has already been decided for her. Outside, the palace clock begins to chime. The sound is deep, deliberate, and slow, as if reminding you that time here is not measured in hours, but in alliances. The day moves in its own slow, steady rhythm, one you can't rush, even if you tried. Which you won't, because honestly, why would you? The sunlight that slants through the narrow mullioned windows is the same pale gold you saw yesterday, and the same you'll see tomorrow. The great hall still smells of yesterday's rushes underfoot, crushed herbs half masking the faint whiff of damp and smoke. You take a seat on a long, heavy bench, and it creaks under your weight as if to remind you it has seen far more distinguished posteriors than yours. Across the hall, a tapestry sags slightly in the middle, a faded scene of knights and unicorns, though the unicorn here has the suspiciously resigned look of a creature that's been stitched by someone who had never seen a horse, much less a mythical one. A servant passes by, balancing a tray of bread, cheese, and a jug of watered wine. The bread is dark, rough, flecked with little seeds that will inevitably lodge themselves in your teeth. You tear off a piece, chew slowly, and listen to the muted thud of boots on flagstones. The talk around you is casual, but you catch fragments. Names of dukes and princesses, whispered in tones that make them sound like characters in a gossip scroll. And here's your historical fact of the day. Many noble families in medieval Europe arranged marriages specifically to keep power in the family, sometimes a little too literally. Cousins marrying cousins, uncles marrying nieces. It sounds like something out of a scandal sheet, but it was often done with entirely straight faces. The problem, of course, is that the family tree can start to look less like a tree and more like a hedge someone has trimmed into a very tight circle. Historians still debate whether certain royal illnesses, madnesses, deformities, chronic frailties were entirely the result of inbreeding or simply bad luck. But the pattern, if nothing else, is noticeable. Your gaze wanders toward the high table, where a young noblewoman sits straight-backed in her carved chair. She is pale in a way that's fashionable here. Not the healthy glow of sun, but the powdered, candlelight hue that suggests she has spent more time indoors than the bread you're currently eating. Her hair, tightly braided and tucked under a delicate net of gold thread, frames a face that is both beautiful and oddly fragile, like porcelain that might crack if you breathed too hard. And here's the obscure tidbit. In some courts, noble women were discouraged from smiling too broadly in public. It was seen as unrefined, even vulgar. Beauty was to be serene, distant, untouchable. So she sips her watered wine with the solemnity of a high priestess, even though you suspect she's thinking about whether the cat will get into the pantry again tonight. There's a soft clink of goblets, a gentle hum of conversation, and somewhere outside, the faint crow of a rooster who has clearly misunderstood the time of day. You settle into the rhythm of it all, feeling the pace of this place slow your own pulse. No one is hurrying. No one is checking a clock. And if you were hoping for some action, well, remember that cheeky warning from earlier? You probably won't make it through this day. But that's the point. The warmth from the hearth seeps toward you. The light outside begins to fade to a dusky blue, and the cat, yes, the same cat, slips in through the half-open door to curl itself into a basket in the corner. The evening stretches before you like a long, unspooled ribbon, and as the hall quiets, you know this is only the beginning. The next morning arrives not with fanfare, but with the gentle, familiar noises of a household waking at its own pace. Somewhere above you, on the creaky upper floor, there's the muffled sound of a chamber pot being emptied out of a window. Below, in the kitchen, the steady chop of a knife on a wooden board. And in the courtyard, the low, rumbling voice of a stable hand talking to a horse like it's his best friend. Which, in fairness, it might be. You step outside into the cold. The air smells faintly of wood smoke and wet stone. Frost crunches under your shoes. The castle's towers loom overhead, their tops fading into a pale morning mist. You glance up at the narrow arrow slits in the walls, imagining the soldiers stationed there through the night, shifting from foot to foot and trying to keep warm. Your path takes you to the small chapel on the edge of the inner bailey. It's dim and smells of beeswax and old incense. The walls are painted with saints in reds and blues so rich you half expect them to reach out and offer you bread. The priest is already there, murmuring prayers that roll and echo through the stone chamber. His voice is soothing, if you don't mind the occasional dramatic emphasis that sounds suspiciously like he's trying to keep himself awake. And here's your historical fact for the morning. Medieval chapels in noble households weren't just for prayer. They were also a stage for showing off wealth. The fabrics draped over the altar, the gilded covers of the prayer books, even the colored glass in the windows. They were statements as much as they were devotions. You're not just worshiping God here, you're making sure God knows you can afford the good stuff. You notice a young girl kneeling in the front row, a princess by her dress, which is heavy with embroidery and pearls that catch the dim light. She can't be more than 13, yet she sits perfectly still, hands folded, face composed into that serene mask again. She is practicing for a lifetime of being watched. Obscure tidbit. In certain courts, royal children were forbidden from playing outdoors in the sun for fear of tanning their skin. A pale complexion meant leisure, wealth, and the luxury of staying indoors. Never mind that it also meant you looked a bit like an undercooked dumpling. As you leave the chapel, the mist begins to lift, revealing the courtyard in more detail. Servants bustle back and forth with baskets of laundry, buckets of water, and trays of food. You spot the noblewoman from yesterday on the balcony above the hall. Her hair is arranged even more elaborately today, twisted into a shape that looks like it required both an instruction manual and a minor miracle. She catches your eye for a brief moment. There's no smile, remember, not in public, but you think you see the tiniest flicker of curiosity. Then she turns, vanishing back inside, her skirts swishing in that controlled, gliding way they seem to teach from childhood. The day stretches ahead. You can almost hear the clinking of goblets and the low hum of gossip that will fill the evening. And for now, you walk back toward the kitchens, letting the cold air sharpen your senses, knowing that in this place, the drama moves at the speed of candle wax melting. The kitchens are a world of their own, warmer, louder, and somehow far more alive than the rest of the castle. You push open a heavy wooden door and are met with a wave of heat and the smell of bread baking. There's a huge hearth at the far end, flames licking at the blackened pot suspended over them. Spits creak as they turn, slow and steady, like they're in no rush to be done. A cook, red-faced and flour-dusted, barks orders to a pair of boys carrying a sack of onions. The boys mutter to each other in a dialect you only half recognize, and you catch one of them making a face behind the cook's back. It's a reminder that medieval kitchens, for all their formality upstairs, are as full of petty drama as any modern workplace. Here's your historical fact for the day. In noble households, kitchen staff were often divided into very specific roles: scullions, spit boys, pastry cooks, sauce makers, each with its own hierarchy. It wasn't just help in the kitchen. It was a miniature society, complete with its own politics and occasional rivalries. As you take in the scene, you notice a strange little contraption in the corner, a wooden box with holes drilled into it, and a small crank. One of the older cooks explains it's for grinding spices. Cinnamon, pepper, cloves, all expensive imports, all handled with care. Obscure tidbit. In some noble kitchens, spice stores were kept locked, with a single trusted servant holding the key, because they were worth more than silver by weight. Someone hands you a hunk of bread, still warm from the oven, with a smear of soft cheese. You bite into it, and it's the best thing you've tasted in days. Which, given the state of medieval seasoning, isn't necessarily saying much, but still it's good. From the kitchen door, you can see the courtyard again. The noblewoman has reappeared, this time with two younger girls trailing behind her. They're dressed nearly identically, matching fabrics, matching hairstyles, even matching expressions of polite detachment. Sisters, you guess. It makes you think about the patterns you've been seeing. The same family names echoing through conversations, the same pale complexions, the same angular features repeated like someone keeps tracing the same sketch over and over. Historians still debate whether the cumulative effects of generations of arranged, close-kin marriages were obvious to people at the time, or whether it was simply accepted as the natural order of things. But standing here, watching those three women move in near-perfect unison, you can't help but feel the threads tying everything a little too tightly together. The cook calls out again, breaking your reverie. Pot needs stirring. A jug needs carrying. The business of daily life refuses to stop for philosophical reflection. And so you move back into the warmth and noise, letting the scent of baking bread wrap around you like a blanket you never want to put down. By midday, the courtyard has transformed. The morning mist has burned away, leaving the stones bright and almost too pale to look at. Sunlight bounces off the windows and makes the metal fittings on the doors glint like they're showing off. The air smells of hay, leather, and something faintly sweet. You trace it to a man selling honeycomb to a pair of kitchen maids. You wander toward the outer wall, where you find the soldiers practicing with pikes. They move in a slow, synchronized rhythm, their boots thudding against the packed dirt. Every so often, the captain shouts a command, and they pivot in unison, pikes swinging like the arms of a giant wooden clock. It's strangely hypnotic, until one soldier sneezes mid-step, throwing the whole line into momentary chaos. Here's your historical fact for the day. Pike drills in the late medieval period weren't just for fighting. They were a public show of discipline. Any visitor to the castle could watch and know that these soldiers could form a wall of sharp metal in seconds if needed. It was intimidation wrapped in choreography. You lean against the wall, letting the sun warm your back. From here, you can see the road winding away from the castle toward the horizon. A small procession approaches, 4 riders, each in fine clothes, with 2 servants trailing behind on foot. The guards at the gate straighten, spears shifting into ready positions, but as the riders draw closer, you see the crest on their cloaks. It's a visiting noble family, you're told, here for a round of marriage discussions. That phrase lands in the courtyard like a quiet bell toll. The household springs into a kind of invisible preparation. Messengers dart off to alert the kitchens, Servants adjust their clothes, and somewhere above, you're certain the noblewoman and her sisters are already arranging themselves into their best, most composed positions. Obscure tidbit. In certain European courts, visiting guests were offered welcome wine in goblets lined with gold leaf, not for the taste, but because swallowing gold dust was believed to strengthen the heart. Whether it actually worked is debatable, but it did make for some impressively expensive urine. The riders dismount, their cloaks swirling in a way that makes you think they practiced it. They disappear into the great hall, and for a moment the courtyard feels like it's holding its breath. Marriage negotiations are serious business here, not just about two people, but about the web of alliances that hold kingdoms together, or pull them apart. You watch the gates swing shut again, the sunlight briefly flashing off the metal studs, and you can't help but think, the drawbridge isn't just a bridge, it's a filter. Only the right people get to cross. You slip into the great hall just as the formal greetings are underway. The hall is cool and shadowed, its high beams darkened with years of smoke. Sunlight pours through a row of narrow windows, pooling on the long table set with polished pewter plates and tall, slightly wobbly candlesticks. The noblewoman from the balcony is seated beside the visiting party. Her face is a mask of polite attention, but you can tell she's listening for the tiny hints and coded phrases that tell you whether these negotiations are going well or sliding toward disaster. Your historical fact here: royal and noble marriage talks were rarely about love. Instead, they were careful transactions balancing land, wealth, military aid, and the prestige of bloodlines. Dowries were calculated like battle plans, and a single sentence in the wrong tone could stall months of preparation. At the far end of the hall, musicians play softly, just enough to make the silence between words feel less awkward. A servant refills goblets, his hands steady despite the tension in the room. Every movement is watched, every glance weighed. There's a moment when the youngest daughter of the visiting family leans forward to admire the embroidery on the noblewoman's gown. The noblewoman smiles, an actual unpracticed smile, and for a heartbeat the whole room relaxes. Then the conversation slides back to territories, inheritances, and the risk of Spanish interference in trade routes, and the air tightens again. Obscure tidbit. In some courts, marriage negotiations included an examination of the bride's dowry chest, not just for value, but for signs of wasteful taste. Too many ribbons or fashionable trinkets could be seen as frivolous, lowering her perceived value as a future household manager. You're sitting near the servants' table at the side, and you catch fragments of their whispered commentary. They're sharper than any courtier's wit, with observations that would probably cause a diplomatic incident if spoken aloud. Historians still debate whether these tense meals ever truly decided anything, or if they were just ceremonial steps in an agreement already made in private. What's certain is that, to everyone in the room, the illusion of the performance mattered as much as the reality. The meal ends with a flourish of spiced wine and sugared almonds. As the guests rise, the noblewoman passes you, her sleeve brushing your arm for the briefest moment. It's nothing. It's everything. It's the kind of moment you tuck away, knowing you'll remember it when the rest of the day fades into the soft blur of history. The afternoon light is slow and golden now, stretching through the corridors like it has nowhere better to be. You follow the noblewoman, not too closely, through a side passage where the stone walls narrow and the scent shifts from roasted meat to beeswax and lavender. The air here feels different, quieter, like the castle is holding its secrets closer. You pass a door half open to a small chamber where two seamstresses work over a length of deep crimson velvet. The fabric catches the light like liquid, their needles glinting in quick, practiced arcs. One of them hums under her breath, a tune you almost recognize before it dissolves into the rhythm of thread pulling through cloth. Your historical fact here. In many medieval courts, high-ranking women's clothing was not only a display of wealth, but a coded statement about alliances. Certain colors or embroidery patterns could signal loyalty to a particular house or region. Crimson, for instance, was expensive to produce and often reserved for occasions where one needed to be unmistakably visible in the room. The noblewoman slips inside another chamber, this one lined with shelves stacked high with carved wooden boxes. The air smells faintly of dried rose petals and the sharp tang of vinegar, preservatives for fabrics and delicate items. She opens a box and pulls out a necklace, a thin chain of gold threaded with pearls. An obscure tidbit: pearls in the Middle Ages weren't always worn for beauty. They were sometimes ground into powder and consumed in a drink as a supposed cure for illness. Whether this was effective or just an extravagant way to flavor your water is, as you might guess, up for debate. She turns the necklace in her hands, as if weighing not just its value, but the meaning it might carry if she wore it tonight. You watch her reflection in the polished lid of the box. Her eyes are focused but not cold. Then she catches sight of you in the doorway. Her brow lifts slightly, like she's both amused and faintly surprised you're still here. You're persistent. Her look seems to say, though she says nothing aloud. She closes the box with a soft click, tucks the necklace under her arm, and sweeps past you into the corridor again. The sound of her footsteps fades, replaced by the gentle echo of your own. Somewhere in the distance, bells toll the hour. You probably won't make it through this day without getting a little lost in these halls. You find yourself back in the courtyard, though you're not entirely sure how. The sun is lower now, painting the stones with long shadows. A light breeze carries the scent of wood smoke from the kitchens and something sweet, apples baking, maybe. By the well, a group of children play a game involving a hoop and a stick, their laughter bright against the otherwise measured hum of castle life. A dog, skinny but alert, darts in and out of their path, tail wagging as if it's in on the joke. The noblewoman is nowhere in sight, but you do see the visitors' horses being tended by stable hands. Their saddles are richly tooled, the leather dark and oiled, the metal fittings shining. One horse shakes its head, sending its bridle bells into a delicate jingle. Your historical fact here: horses were a significant part of noble dowries in some parts of Europe, not just for transportation but as symbols of military strength and prestige. A well-bred horse could be worth more than a small farm, and gifting one in a marriage agreement was as much a statement as any land grant. A stable hand leans on his pitchfork and tells you in a low voice that the guests will stay for several nights. More meals, more negotiations, more careful performances. He grins like he knows this means the kitchens will be working well past dark. Obscure tidbit. Some medieval castles kept special guest bees in hives near the kitchens. Their honey was reserved exclusively for visiting dignitaries, to give the impression of abundance and generosity. Whether the guests ever realized they were eating from a diplomatic beehive is unclear. You wander toward the outer wall again, tracing your hand over the rough stone. The air beyond smells of cold grass and damp earth. Somewhere, a raven calls once, twice, and then falls silent. Historians still debate whether these long visits were genuinely for relationship building or if they were simply endurance tests, seeing who could maintain charm and composure the longest without cracking. Either way, you have the feeling this visit will change something. Not loudly, not immediately, but in the quiet rearranging of alliances you'll only notice later. The sun slides lower still, the sky softening into lavender and pale gold. The shadows lengthen, the courtyard quiets, and you're left with the steady rhythm of the castle breathing around you. The day isn't over yet, but it's starting to fold into its evening self. Evening begins its slow approach, draping the castle in cooler air and longer shadows. You notice it first in the way the torch brackets along the inner walls are being checked and refilled. Oil sloshing softly in metal bowls, wicks trimmed with quick, practiced snips. Someone passes you carrying an armful of rushes, the clean grassy scent still clinging to them. Soon they'll be scattered across the floors to mask the day's less charming aromas. From the great hall comes a low thrum of preparation. Clay jugs clinking, the shuffle of wooden platters being set in place. The fire in the massive hearth is already lit, throwing light that dances up the dark timbers and gilds the edges of banners hanging overhead. You're ushered toward one of the long tables by a servant who looks both determined and entirely uninterested in your opinion on the matter. Your place is near the lower end, far from the high table where the noblewoman sits, but close enough to observe. Historical fact: medieval banquets often began with what was called a pottage course, a thick stew of grains, vegetables, and occasionally meat, served in deep bowls. It wasn't just food. It was an edible warm-up for the richer dishes to come, much like how modern restaurants bring you bread before the main course. The noblewoman is dressed differently now. Her gown is a deep blue, the fabric heavy and perfectly fitted, with sleeves so long they nearly brush the floor. Around her waist is a belt of braided gold, and in her hair, a fine net that glitters faintly in the firelight. Obscure tidbit: in certain courts, hairnets were sometimes scented with herbs like lavender or rosemary, turning a simple headpiece into a walking perfumery. It was a subtle way to project refinement, provided the wind didn't change and blow the scent straight into someone's soup. The first dishes arrive: trencher bread with slices of soft cheese, a dish of poached pears and wine. The hall fills with a warm blend of aromas: spiced cinnamon, roasting meat, and the faint tang of vinegar from pickled vegetables. As you eat, you notice the rhythm of the evening taking shape. Toasts are made, small bursts of laughter punctuate the air, and every now and then, A sidelong glance is exchanged between guests and hosts. Historians still debate whether these banquets were more about diplomacy or display. Was the food a genuine offering of hospitality, or simply the edible equivalent of a resume? Perhaps both. By the time the servants bring out a dish of roasted game bird, the firelight feels softer, and the murmur of voices has become almost hypnotic. You probably won't make it through this night without feeling pleasantly drowsy. Later, after the hall has quieted to a comfortable hum, you slip away through a side door into a smaller chamber lit by a single candle. The flickering light casts the shelves and chests into pools of shadow, and the air is warmer here, carrying the faint scent of dried figs and honey. This is the pantry, though it feels almost ceremonial in its order. Clay jars line the walls, their contents marked with loops of twine and ink tags, flour, salt, preserved fruits, herbs. A mouse rustles somewhere in the far corner, and you're reminded that no matter how grand a household might be, it's never entirely free of small, determined visitors. You run your hand along the edge of a wooden crate filled with almonds, their shells rough beneath your fingertips. Nearby, a jar of preserved quince gleams like amber in the candlelight. Historical fact: sugar was considered a luxury in much of medieval Europe, and sweet dishes were often reserved for the wealthiest tables. Serving candied fruit or spiced honey wasn't just a treat, it was a message that you could afford something most people might taste once a year, if that. Obscure tidbit: some households stored sugar in locked boxes, not just to protect it from pests but from casual sampling by the kitchen staff. Imagine a box of chocolates today with an actual iron key, and you'll get the idea. From the pantry you step into the narrow warmth of the kitchen, where a few servants are still at work even though the main feast is winding down. A pot of something rich and dark simmers gently over the fire, the aroma curling into the air like a secret. One cook, sleeves rolled high, stirs slowly with a long-handled spoon. She glances up and says, "For the morning," before returning to her task. You have the feeling she's not just talking about the food. Historians still debate whether the kitchens of great houses were more chaotic or more disciplined. Accounts vary. Some describe them as models of efficiency, others as frantic, smoky warrens of shouting, clanging pans, and occasional accidents. Tonight, though, the mood here is steady, almost meditative. You linger a moment longer, listening to the gentle bubble of the pot and the soft crackle of the hearth. The rest of the castle hums on in the distance, but here it's just the warm air, the flicker of light, and the quiet certainty that another day will follow this one. You step back into the corridor, and the sudden cool air feels like a polite reminder that you've wandered far enough into the warm, hidden parts of the castle. Your footsteps sound faintly hollow against the worn flagstones, the kind of echo that makes you instinctively walk slower, as if to avoid disturbing the air. A servant carrying a shallow brass basin passes you, nodding politely without slowing down. The basin is filled with steaming water, and the faint scent of mint rises from it. You watch as they disappear into a nearby doorway, where the muffled sound of a noblewoman's voice carries faintly over the threshold. Historical fact: in some courts, evening washings were part of the nightly routine, a small but telling sign of refinement. While bathing was not as frequent as in modern life, warm water for the face and hands before bed was a gesture of both comfort and health, especially if you could scent it with imported herbs. The hallway bends, and you find yourself in a quieter wing of the castle. The rushes underfoot here are newer, cleaner, almost plush in their thickness. A long embroidered tapestry runs along the wall, its colors muted but still rich, blues deep as twilight, reds soft as worn velvet. Obscure tidbit: some tapestries doubled as insulation during winter. They're heavy, weave trapping warm air inside rooms. Of course, they also doubled as excellent gossip sources if you happen to stand behind one. Many a whispered conversation was overheard by someone conveniently checking the stitches. You pause by a narrow window, looking out over the outer bailey. The snow is falling again, flakes drifting past the flickering light of the torches. Down below, a stable boy hurries to latch the gate against the wind. The barn cat from earlier, remember her curled on the straw basket, is now prowling the edge of the yard, tail twitching. Historians still debate whether castle nights were truly as silent as the romantic image suggests. In reality, there was always some sound. Wind in the chimneys, a distant dog barking, the quiet thump of footsteps on wood. Tonight, though, it's the kind of quiet that wraps around you like a cloak. You lean a little on the window ledge, letting the cold air drift over your face. Somewhere down the hall, a soft chime signals the approach of the castle's bedtime. You probably won't make it much longer before following its cue. Later, you're shown to a small guest chamber. The door creaks as it swings open, revealing a bed piled high with furs, a small table by the window, and a single candle already lit. The air smells faintly of beeswax and wood smoke. The bed is a wooden frame with rope supports beneath the mattress, which is stuffed with straw and covered with linen sheets. It's surprisingly comfortable, at least compared to the floor, which is still cold enough to make your toes curl. Historical fact: rope beds were common in medieval households, and their tautness needed to be adjusted regularly. In fact, the phrase "sleep tight" may have originated from the need to pull the ropes tight before lying down. If you forgot, you'd find yourself sinking slowly toward the floor in the night. Romantic in theory, awkward in practice. A small chest sits at the foot of the bed. Inside, there's an extra blanket, a pair of wool socks, and a folded tunic that's clearly not yours. Hospitality, in this household, includes making sure your sleepwear is warmer than your dignity. Obscure tidbit: some wealthy homes place sprigs of certain herbs, like rue or chamomile, beneath the pillow, believing they would ward off nightmares. Whether it worked or not, the scent would at least have been soothing, unless you accidentally picked the wrong herb and ended up with something pungent enough to keep you awake. You set your candle on the table and glance out the window. The snow is falling heavier now, coating the yard in white. Somewhere below, a door thuds shut, and the sound echoes faintly upward. Historians still debate whether guests were truly left in peace at night or whether servants came and went, checking the fires and securing the shutters. Either way, you feel the kind of tired that settles not just in your body but in your thoughts. You sit on the bed, listening to the wind against the walls. The furs are heavy, the sheets cool, and the faint scent of herbs lingers in the air. If sleep comes quickly, you won't complain. And if it doesn't, well, there's always tomorrow's slow pace to carry you through. You wake to the sound of faint movement in the hallway. A soft shuffle, a muted clink, the creak of a distant hinge. It's still early, you can tell, because the pale light seeping through the shutters has that bluish tint it gets just before dawn. Somewhere beyond your door, a fire is being coaxed awake. The smell of wood smoke drifts in, curling under the door like a polite invitation to get up. But the furs are heavy, the bed ropes are still taut, and your body isn't entirely convinced. Historical fact. In many castles, the day began long before sunrise for the servants. Fires needed to be lit, floors swept, and the morning meal prepared before the nobles stirred. For guests like you, this bustle was a background hum. Evidence of a household that kept its own rhythm regardless of whether you were ready to join it. You eventually swing your legs over the side of the bed, your feet meeting the cold floor with a little shock that does a better job waking you than any rooster ever could. You dress quickly, layering the borrowed tunic over your own clothes, because medieval winters are no time for vanity. As you step into the hall, you notice something. Yesterday's rushes have been swept and replaced with fresh ones, sprinkled with dried lavender. The scent is subtle but steady, like a quiet note in the air. Obscure tidbit. Lavender was often thought to repel insects and freshen the air. In some places, it was even believed to ward off evil spirits, which means your hallway is now both seasonally clean and, hopefully, spiritually secure. You follow the faint murmur of voices toward the great hall. The fire there is roaring now, casting a warm glow across the trestle tables. Bread is being sliced, cheese set out, and a large pot simmers over the hearth. The smell is enough to make you realize how long it's been since you ate anything warm. Historians still debate how elaborate medieval breakfasts were. Some accounts suggest it was a modest affair: bread, ale, maybe a bit of cold meat, while others record something heartier. Today, it looks like you're in for a generous spread, which is perhaps the castle's way of reminding you it likes to keep its guests fed and content. A servant gestures for you to sit, and you do, the wooden bench creaking faintly. Outside, the light is slowly turning gold. The day is starting whether you're ready or not. After breakfast, you step outside into the courtyard. The snow from last night lies crisp and clean, crunching under your boots. The air is sharp and fresh, the kind that makes you take deeper breaths just because you can. The castle is busy already. Stable hands leading horses to water, a washerwoman hanging damp linens despite the cold, and a pair of guards pacing the walls in slow, measured steps. Everyone moves with purpose, as if the cold has trimmed away any unnecessary dawdling. Historical fact. Many castles functioned as small self-sufficient communities, with smiths, bakers, and craftsmen all working within or just beyond the walls. This meant that on any given day, the courtyard could be as lively as a village market, minus the shouting vendors and plus the occasional armed patrol. You wander toward the stables, where the warm, earthy scent of hay and horses is almost comforting. A boy no older than 12 is brushing down a large chestnut mare, humming a tune that seems to be more for his own company than for the horses. Obscure tidbit. In some regions, it was believed that whispering into a horse's ear could calm it or even teach it secrets. Whether this worked or not is unclear, but the image of a stable hand murmuring gossip to a patient mare is strangely charming. From here, you can see the village beyond the castle gates. Smoke rises from its chimneys, curling into the sky. A cart rattles along the road, wheels squeaking against the frost. Historians still debate how freely guests were allowed to wander beyond the castle grounds. Some accounts suggest guests could stroll into nearby villages without question, while others imply there was always a watchful eye ensuring you didn't wander too far. You suspect that if you tried to head out alone right now, at least one guard would suddenly decide to happen to be going the same way. You stand a moment longer, feeling the winter sun on your face. It's faint but welcome, like a candle in a cold room. The day is young, and the castle hums with quiet industry. Somewhere in the back of your mind, you start to wonder what small surprises it will hold before night falls again. The sun has risen fully now, and the castle's stone walls are washed in pale gold. You find yourself drifting toward the kitchens again. Not out of hunger exactly, but because that's where the liveliest conversation always seems to be. Inside, it's warm enough that your cheeks tingle from the change in temperature. The cooks are in the middle of preparing the day's main meal, which is a bit like watching a dance troupe that doesn't particularly like each other but still knows the steps. Historical fact. In many large medieval households, the midday meal was the most important of the day, with multiple courses served in quick succession. This was partly practical. Daylight hours were precious in winter, and partly ceremonial, a way of displaying the household's wealth to any guests or visiting dignitaries. Today, the air is thick with the smell of roasting meat, simmering onions, and fresh herbs. A large spit turns slowly over the fire, tended by a boy whose arms must ache but who hides it behind an expression of deep concentration. At one table, a woman is rolling out dough for pies, her forearms dusted with flour. She works quickly but carefully, pausing now and then to sprinkle something into the filling that you can't quite identify. Obscure tidbit. Certain herbs were believed to have protective or even romantic properties. For example, borage was thought to bring courage, while rosemary was tied to memory and fidelity. A suspiciously generous pinch of rosemary in your pie might mean more than just flavor. One of the cooks notices you lingering and hands you a small piece of warm bread, still fragrant from the oven. It's dense, chewy, and almost sweet, the kind of bread you could happily live on for days if it didn't run out first. Historians still debate the exact variety of grains most households used. Wheat was preferred for white bread, but in much of Europe, rye, barley, and oats were far more common. White bread was a luxury, a status symbol, and often reserved for the nobility. You can't help wondering whether your warm slice came from the guest portion or the staff loaf. As you leave the kitchen, the scents cling to you. A faint perfume of heat and flour, smoke and spice. The great hall is being set for the meal already. Trestle tables lined with clean cloths and pewter plates that gleam in the light. By midday, the great hall is alive with sound. The fire roars, the tables groan under the weight of platters, and the air is thick with laughter, conversation, and the occasional bark of a hound that's been promised scraps. You take your seat at one of the long tables, not far from the head of the room. Servants move efficiently between benches, refilling jugs of ale and placing steaming trenchers in front of each guest. Historical fact: trenchers were thick slices of stale bread used as plates. They soaked up juices and sauces during the meal, and at the end they could be eaten, fed to dogs, or given to the poor. You're not sure whether this is a brilliant form of edible dishware or just medieval laziness, but it works. The first course arrives. A thick stew, dark and fragrant, ladled into your trencher. You take a cautious bite and find it's rich with root vegetables, herbs, and some kind of tender meat that melts on your tongue. Obscure tidbit: some medieval recipes called for mixing sweet and savory flavors in ways that feel unusual now, like adding dates, prunes, or even sugar to meat dishes. It wasn't just about taste. Sugar and imported spices like cinnamon were expensive, so using them was a way to show off. The conversation around you ebbs and flows. You catch fragments. Someone discussing the grain yield from last year's harvest. Another person laughing about a snowstorm that stranded them in a monastery. Historians still debate just how rowdy or refined these meals could be. Some chronicles describe strict seating orders, formal toasts, and quiet conversation, while others record brawls, spilled drinks, and arguments loud enough to carry out into the courtyard. Today, it's somewhere in between, polite enough to be comfortable, but warm enough to feel like everyone's guard is down a little. When the second course arrives, a roasted bird, golden-skinned and fragrant, you realize there's no hope of leaving the table hungry. A servant passes you a slice, and you're struck by how deeply satisfying it is to eat slowly, with no clock ticking in the background, as if time itself has decided to lounge at the table with you. By the time the meal winds down, the fire has burned low, the room smells of wood smoke and spices, and you're leaning back on the bench, content in a way that's both physical and strangely peaceful. After the meal, the great hall empties slowly, like a river that's found a dozen little tributaries. People drift away in ones and twos, some toward the kitchens to bargain for a bit of extra bread to take away, some toward the solar for quiet conversation, others disappearing into courtyards and passageways as if the castle itself has absorbed them. You find your steps taking you up a narrow spiral staircase, the kind that's just wide enough for one person and just steep enough to make you wonder if you'll regret the climb. The air here is cooler, touched with the faint scent of old stone and the sharper tang of lime wash from a recently repaired wall. Historical fact: spiral staircases in castles often ascended clockwise, favoring right-handed defenders, meaning anyone charging up the stairs with a sword would be at a disadvantage, their weapon arm hemmed in by the wall. You imagine a guard or two stationed here in centuries past, and it's oddly comforting to think that even architecture could play defense. At the top, you emerge into a small gallery. Sunlight streams through narrow, arched windows, painting pale rectangles onto the wooden floor. Outside, you can see the snowy courtyard you crossed that morning, now tracked with boot prints, paw prints, and the faint crisscross of a broom that's clearly fighting a losing battle. A woman in a deep green gown is bent over an embroidery frame near the window. Her needle flashes in the light, pulling bright threads into the cloth in a pattern you can't quite see. Obscure tidbit: embroidery in noble households wasn't just a pastime. It could be political. Some stitched banners for allies, others embroidered devotional scenes to gift to churches, and a few even hid subtle family emblems into the work as quiet displays of loyalty. You wonder what's hidden in hers, if anything. She glances up and smiles faintly before returning to her work, and you sense this is a space where talking is optional, maybe even discouraged. The quiet is so complete you can hear the faint scratching of the thread against the linen. Historians still debate whether such private, domestic workspaces were more social hubs for the women of the household or solitary retreats. Judging from the peaceful stillness here, you suspect the answer might simply be both, depending on the mood. After a while, you step away, letting the green-gowned woman keep her calm little kingdom. Somewhere downstairs, a door thuds shut, and the sound echoes faintly through the stone like a distant drumbeat. The afternoon light shifts, becoming softer, more golden, and you wander into the castle's chapel. The door creaks as you push it open, and the air inside is cooler, tinged with the faint smell of beeswax, stone dust, and something almost metallic that you can't quite name. Candles flicker along the altar, their flames small but steady against the winter chill. A few figures are scattered through the pews, some kneeling, some sitting with heads bowed, others simply gazing at the stained glass windows as if the colored light alone could answer their prayers. Historical fact: many medieval chapels were small private spaces for the Lord's family and household, distinct from the larger parish church. These spaces often doubled as places for family ceremonies, christenings, weddings, even treaty signings, giving them a mix of sacred and political weight. You slide into a bench at the back. The wood is smooth from years of use, warm where the sun catches it. The only sound is the low murmur of a priest near the altar, speaking to someone whose voice you can't hear. Obscure tidbit: in some noble chapels, relics were displayed not only for devotion but as a kind of spiritual status symbol. A fragment of a saint's bone, a scrap of cloth said to have touched a holy figure. These were displayed in ornate reliquaries and sometimes brought out during special occasions. In a world where armies could take your land, the right relic might be the only kind of protection you could carry without drawing a sword. Historians still debate the authenticity of many of these relics. Were they genuine fragments from centuries past, or clever forgeries traded by ambitious merchants? The truth is probably a little of both, but you notice how the people here treat them carefully, reverently, and wonder if belief itself is part of the relic's power. The light through the windows shifts again, now casting deep reds and golds over the stone floor. You watch the colors flicker and fade, like the chapel is breathing. For a moment, the whole castle feels hushed, as if the walls themselves are holding their breath. You step back into the corridor, and it feels as though the chapel's quiet has clung to you like a second cloak. The castle is still, though not silent. The kind of stillness that allows you to hear the faraway scuff of boots, the muted clink of a latch, the distant trill of a bird outside braving the cold. The hallway curves toward the outer wall, where narrow windows overlook the frozen river beyond. You pause at one, leaning on the stone sill. The water is locked in white and silver, its surface uneven and crusted with wind-blown snow. The sun catches the ice, making it gleam like hammered metal. Historical fact: frozen rivers in winter sometimes became impromptu roads in medieval Europe, faster and smoother than muddy tracks, and often safer than the woods. Merchants would drive carts directly over the ice, trusting the cold to hold them. Sometimes they were wrong. You imagine a creak, a crack, and a plunge no one could survive. And you decide perhaps you prefer the safety of the castle walls after all. As you turn to leave, a servant rounds the corner carrying a tray with a pewter jug and a cluster of small cups. The steam rising from the jug smells faintly of mulled cider, spiced with cloves, maybe a hint of rosemary. You're offered a cup without a word, and the warmth of it seeps into your fingers instantly. Obscure tidbit: in certain noble households, serving hot drinks to guests at dusk was as much about showing off the spice cupboard as it was about hospitality. Nutmeg, cinnamon, cloves. These were proof of wealth and connections. A castle without spices was like a modern mansion without Wi-Fi. Still impressive, but you'd notice the lack. Historians still debate whether such rituals were purely social or had roots in older wintertime blessings. The line between superstition, tradition, and etiquette was never as sharp as we might imagine. You finish the drink, set the cup back on the tray, and feel the heat trace its way into your chest. Somewhere nearby, a bell begins to toll, slow, measured, as if counting down the evening. The sun has slid behind the hills, and the castle's light now comes from fires, torches, and the golden glow of candles. Shadows stretch across the stone floors, soft and long, like cats settling in for the night. You wander toward the main hall once more, where the hearth is blazing high. The benches are mostly empty now, just a few figures huddled close to the fire, their faces flickering in the orange light. A young boy plays absently with a wooden top, letting it spin until it wobbles and falls, then spinning it again. Historical fact: winter evenings in a medieval castle were often times for storytelling, music, or quiet craftwork. In a world without clocks, night was marked not by hours but by the gradual dimming of the day and the slow quieting of the household. Someone is plucking a lute in the corner. Not a song exactly, just idle notes drifting upward. The sound mingles with the fire's crackle and the low murmur of conversation, creating a kind of lull that settles into your bones. Obscure tidbit: some medieval lutes were strung with gut not just from sheep, but from deer or even exotic imports, depending on the owner's connections. It's the sort of detail you wouldn't guess unless you were the unlucky one assigned to prepare the strings. Historians still debate how much music in a lord's hall was formal performance versus casual background, like the medieval equivalent of a playlist you didn't think too hard about. Tonight, it feels more like the latter. The air is warm now, rich with the mingled sense of wood smoke and roasted meat lingering from earlier. Someone yawns loudly. Another leans back against the bench, eyes half closed. The night deepens, and the castle exhales. You stay by the fire a while longer, letting the warmth wrap around you. The light dances over the stone walls, shifting with each small flicker of the flames, painting the air in gold and shadow. Somewhere above, the wind moves across the battlements, low and steady, a sound like the sea you've never seen but somehow can imagine. Your eyes follow the curling smoke from the hearth as it drifts upward and dissolves into the dim air of the rafters. You listen to the faint rustle of cloth as someone shifts nearby, the tiny scrape of a cup set gently on wood, the faraway drip of melting snow from the eaves outside. The castle seems to have folded itself into a slower rhythm, breathing deeply now, resting. The walls hold centuries of these winter nights, each one layered on the last, the quiet building like soft snowfall. You feel it settle over you, light but certain, as if the weight of time itself is a kind of blanket. Your mind drifts to the streets beyond the gates, now silent under the snow, to the river lying frozen and still, to the fields sleeping beneath their white covers, waiting for the thaw. All of it part of the same winter breath. The fire hums low, a steady heart in the room. Your shoulders ease, your breath deepens. The sounds blur at the edges, the light grows softer, and the stories of the day recede like footprints filling with snow. It is winter, it is night, and here, in this moment, everything is very, very still.